So for agenda, I'm going to start by talking about what I consider are the key performance attributes. Then I'm going to do like this 100,000-foot view of modern JVM architectures, and in particular the GC architectures. Then we'll get into these basic concepts. So the performance attributes, I often talk about this as a three-legged stool. And the three performance attributes are throughput, latency, and footprint. In the Java performance book, I mentioned this principle that I just gave it a label called the 2 or 3 principle. And it basically says that improving one of these or one or two of these performance attributes, you're going to sacrifice something in at least one of the others. And if you think about that, I think you can kind of come to terms with that. After I wrote the book, and I've had some conversations with some really smart people, perhaps people that are smarter than I am, we talked about this a little bit. And there are cases where you want to improve all 3 of these performance attributes. But in doing so, it usually requires an awful lot of work. And usually it involves a lot of software development work. So I would revise that 2 or 3 principle. Another thing that I've learned since I published the book, and this principle I've yet to come up with a name for, and that is an improvement in throughput or latency may reduce or lower the amount of available CPU to the application. And this translates to that system has some sort of capacity to it, and that's usually limited to the amount of CPU. Usually memory is not so much a limitation as what the amount of CPU that you can use. So really there's another principle in here and another performance attribute that I kind of call capacity. It's really not an accurate term, but it really is talking about if I'm going to improve throughput, improve latency, there's a good chance that I may have an impact on how much CPU I have available for other things that I want to run on that application. This might be important for some applications. Somebody who's a cloud provider where they're looking for efficiency. Making that kind of a trade-off is an important decision for them. So there's another element in here of capacity. So perhaps there's an enhanced 3-legged stool here. Somewhere we have to fit in this capacity thing. And I'm struggling to figure out where in this 3-legged stool does this thing fit. Maybe it's a 4-legged stool. Anyway, those are the 4 performance attributes for us to be thinking about. So we'll come back to those performance attributes in just a second. Let's take a look at a high-level view of the modern JVM GC architectures. So if we look at all modern JVMs today, we'll find that almost every one of them, at least to my knowledge, are using what's called a generational GC. And basically the idea behind a generational GC is you segregate the objects by age into different spaces, and you bias the collection of younger objects. So in other words, you do collections on younger objects more frequently. And typically there's 2 generations, a young generation and an old generation. A generational GC could have additional generations. And one idea that I have floated around with various different people has been the notion of an intermediate region. There's applications out there, for instance, that have what I would call intermediate objects. They're not something that lives for a short period of time and then die, but yet there's something that lives a little bit longer than, say, a transaction, but yet they don't live for the life of the application. They're kind of a teenage object. And I labeled this idea as teenage liveness GC. And this is where objects go and die in teenage wasteland. And for you, the guys that know me, you know that I can rarely do a presentation and not squeeze in a little bit of the who somewhere. Okay, so with JVMs today that have generational GCs, so in Hotspot, all of the GCs that are supported by Oracle are generational GCs. They have a young and an old generation. JRocket also has All other GCs are generational. The exception to that is the real-time, JRocket real-time. It's a single generation collector. Zing from Azul, C4 is a generational collector. J9 from IBM, as far as I know, I'll admit that I don't know a lot about the J9 collectors. They are generational GCs. I think the one exception to that is their real-time collector called Metronome. If you want to know more about IBM J9, I'm sure John is roaming around here somewhere and he can give you all of the gory details. Okay, so why would you do a generational GC? In my opinion, the primary reason is based on the weak generational hypothesis. And that basically says that most objects die young. And the number one reason for doing a generational GC is for improving throughput. If we take a brief look at the hotspot JVM's heap layout, there's a young generation space, and it's responsible for new and young objects. So that's what is held in the young generation. There's also an old generation. This is for the older, longer-lived objects. Prior to JDK8, there was another space here called the permanent generation. In JDK8, this has been eliminated in favor of what's called a metaspace. In very simplistic terms, basically what this means is, in both prior to JDK8 and JDK8 going forward, permanent generation versus metaspace, as far as what it does functionally, it basically does the same thing. It holds class metadata and VM information. So the biggest difference between the two is, prior to JDK8, you had this nasty little tuning the permanent generation size. So metaspace has implemented out a native code, and it's something you don't have to worry about with tuning its size. It basically is going to grow as you need it. You can override and set and say that I only want it to use a specific amount of memory. But that's basically the difference. If we look a little bit closer at the hotspot VM layout of young generation, there's an Eden space, there's a from survivor space, and a to survivor space. So young generation is divided up a little bit further. So to illustrate how this works, in a let me say it this way. When your application executes, it starts allocating objects. When it allocates an object, that object allocation happens in the Eden space. When that Eden space is exhausted, a minor collection occurs, or a young collection occurs. What happens then is anything that's live is then copied to the to survivor space. In addition to that, anything that is live in the from survivor space also gets copied to the to survivor space. So these survivor spaces, the idea behind that is it's retaining and aging young objects during the young and minor GCs. At some point later, at some age threshold, they will get moved from the survivor space into the old generation. We'll come back to this diagram and in this picture a little bit later in the slides, because we're first going to talk and focus on young generation and the decisions that we're going to make around tuning the garbage collector for young generation. So when tuning GC, the general approach is we want to think about it in terms of frequency. The questions you should be asking yourself and the people that use your application are, how often can I live with a GC event occurring? How often can a minor GC event occur? How often can a full collection occur? If you have a concurrent GC, how often can a concurrent cycle occur? The other question to ask is duration. For a stop-the-world GC, how long of a GC pause can I tolerate? How long can my application be stopped while it's doing garbage collection? For a concurrent collector, the question you can ask is, how much capacity or how much CPU consumption am I willing to have that concurrent collector use? How much additional memory might I have to use to deal with that floating garbage? How much am I willing to sacrifice in the way of additional CPU or additional memory for that concurrent collector? Those are the types of questions you want to be asking. An important note here is the answers to these questions are going to differ wildly between applications. You'll probably even find, as you talk to people who use the same application, they're going to give you differing answers. So it's going to be important as you talk to people who use the application, what is most important to them? Put some values on the frequency and duration of those garbage collection events. Okay, so let's start moving into the concepts. So the first concept we're going to talk about is the frequency of minor or young GCs. And the frequency of a minor GC is dictated by the object allocation rate of the application. In other words, how fast is it allocating objects? The other thing that dictates the frequency of a minor collection, in the hotspot case, it's the size of the Eden space. For the other generational JVMs, it's going to be the size of that space where new objects are allocated. For the stop the world collectors, once that space is exhausted, you're going to get a GC event. For a concurrent collector, there's usually some kind of an occupancy threshold of that space where you're allocating new objects, that once it's surpassed, it starts some concurrent garbage collection event. It's at that point where you'll see the additional consumption of CPU cycles. So how do I go about changing the frequency of a minor GC event? So let's say that you're running an application and you say, you know what, we're getting GC events too often. Okay, what are my choices? What do I need to do? Well, in the case of hotspot, you make the Eden size bigger. Let's assume that the object allocation rate stays the same. One choice is to make the Eden size bigger. So as an example, suppose we got an Eden size of 512 megabyte. Obviously, if I double the size of the Eden space size, with the same allocation rate, this is pretty obvious. I get a 2x increase in Eden space. The time between my GC events now increases by 2x. My minor GC frequency is now cut in half. This is pretty obvious, right? Okay. So some additional choices for making Eden size smaller. So if you're working with the hotspot JVM, here's the command line options you'd use to increase the young generation or the Eden size if you're using CMS GC or parallel GC or serial GC. You may also want to use survivor ratio if you want to keep the size of the young generation the same, but just manipulate the size of Eden. So survivor ratio says how much of the ratio of the young generation do I want to designate to the survivor spaces. In the case of G1 GC, it's a little more interesting. G1 GC has a lot of heuristics in it. Its basic premise is you set a pause time target, it magically figures out how to adapt to meeting that pause time target. So what you do is if you said my GC events are occurring too frequently, minor GC events are occurring too frequently, and I want them to occur less frequently, what you can do here is you could increase the pause time target. Generally, the G1 heuristics assume that a greater pause time implies a larger Eden space. So the other choice that you've got here is you could reduce the object allocation rate. So if you reduce the object allocation rate, you have a same size Eden space. Obviously, the Eden space fills more slowly with a reduced object allocation rate. So as an example, suppose we've got a 40 megabyte per second object allocation rate. I've got a 512 megabyte Eden space. If I cut in half the object allocation rate, keep the same size Eden space, it's obvious, right? I've got a 2x drop in allocation rate. The time to fill Eden space increases by 2x. The time between GCs is now 2x greater. The challenge is going to be, how do I go about reducing the object allocation rate? So what you'd do is you'd profile the application, you'd focus on reducing object allocations, especially the unnecessary object allocations. Another choice you could have here is essentially throttle the application, slow down the application. You reduce the injection rate of the load that the application's taking on. Okay, second important concept. the duration, or the amount of time that a GC pause or the collection of collecting young generation takes. So the number of live objects has the strongest influence on the minor GC duration. GC only visits, the term that you'll hear in GC lingo is going to be mark. It only marks and evacuates live objects. There's other things that can influence minor GC duration: overuse, or I would say abuse, of reference objects, weak, soft, phantom, final references, the memory locality of those marked objects, and the evacuation location where you're copying them to. You might have a young generation object that's kept alive by some old generation reference. There could be some other reasons too that could impact the duration of a minor GC. But ideally, what you want to strive for is, and what you want to be able to observe if you can find the information from the GC logs or from the system or by profiling, is the minor GC duration should be dominated by the marking and evacuation times. If that's not the case, you've got something else going on in the application or in the garbage collector that's worthy to take a look at. You may need an expert to help you in that area. So some of the choices for reducing minor GC pause time: obviously faster memory, CPU, in general a faster system. Hey, that's obvious, that's easy. Maybe a faster stop-the-world GC algorithm, if you're working with a stop-the-world garbage collector. Maybe you look for a faster algorithm. Maybe you look for a concurrent collector for young generation. It may introduce more CPU consumption, which could reduce the available capacity of that system. It may also require some additional memory footprint to handle the floating garbage. Another choice is the fewer live objects. I'm going to focus on the last choice there, the realizing of fewer live objects. So some strategies you can use for achieving fewer live objects per minor GC. You could have a smaller Eden space. Fewer objects in general imply fewer live objects, but that's not always true. A smaller Eden space implies that the Eden space fills faster. It implies more frequent minor GCs. There's less time for an object to die. And in general, there's a higher live objects to objects allocated ratio. I think if you step back and you think about this, I think you kind of come to terms with that. A common approach with a smaller Eden size is you work with a concurrent collector in the old generation. And in essence, what you're doing is you're pushing this collection work off until later. And what this generally leads to is more frequent old generation concurrent collections and higher overall CPU consumption, which then again can also impact this capacity. So some additional strategies for realizing fewer live objects. You could remove or focus on unnecessary object retention. So what I mean by object retention is there's a set of objects that's retained when you do a garbage collection. There may be a set of those or a portion of those that may be unnecessarily retained as an artifact of some object that you've allocated. This is going to take some expertise of somebody who's familiar with the application to know whether what is live at the end of a collection is something that is necessary for the application. So generally what you do is you profile the application, you look for, one of the things you could look for is a potential assignment between two objects that span multiple generations. And when you have this scenario, you have an object, or you could have an object in young generation that looks to be alive. When you do a young generation collection, it could be held by an object that is actually unreachable in old generation. But the young generation collector doesn't know that. It doesn't know what's live in old generation. I should say not all young generation garbage collectors know that. And if you look at the source code for Java util linked list clear, there's a little comment in there that says, basically, this is what they are doing. They were clearing these references and setting them to null to help the garbage collector figure out that, hey, if you happen to have an object in a linked list, and those references span, the assignment spans multiple generations, it's telling the garbage collector, hey, I'm helping you out here. This guy really isn't live anymore. Okay, third important concept. We're going to shift to talking about old generation now. So first, some background info here. There's lots of variations on old generation collectors. There's stop-the-world old generation collectors. There's concurrent collectors. There's mostly concurrent old generation collectors. In the hotspot JVM, parallel GC, parallel old, and serial GC are stop-the-world collectors. Hotspots CMS GC and G1 GC are mostly concurrent. They have a couple of phases that are stop-the-world, which is why they are called mostly concurrent. JRocket has both stop-the-world and mostly concurrent GCs. Azul Zing C4 is a concurrent GC. IBM's J9, as far as I know, have both stop-the-world and mostly concurrent GCs. So back to this diagram. So we saw earlier how objects are allocated here, and when the Eden space becomes full, we do this minor collection, and things get migrated into anything that's live, goes to the survivor spaces. We do some aging here of those objects per minor GC. At some point, if that object is still live, it gets promoted into the old generation space. Okay. So similar to young generation collection frequency, old generation collection frequency. So the old generation collection frequency is dictated by the promotion rate, the rate at which objects are promoted from young generation to old generation. Now the hotspot JVM promotes objects based on an age tenuring threshold. And this age is the number of minor GCs that an object survives. The age tenuring threshold is computed at each minor GC by the hotspot JVM, and that's compared to the object's age, and anything that's equal or greater to that age is then promoted into the old generation. So not only is the promotion rate something that dictates the collection frequency of old generation, also the size of the old generation space dictates the frequency of old generation collection. This makes sense, right? So if you have a certain amount of space, you've got a static size there, it fills at some rate. If I make it bigger, it fills at a slower rate. Okay, so how do I reduce old generation collection frequency? So the strategies here for reducing the promotion rate is a more effective object aging. It's leveraging what you can do in the survivor spaces. So in hotspot, you start tuning this thing called the survivor ratio. And what you're striving to do is you're striving to promote objects at what's called the max tenoring threshold. The JVM, the hotspot JVM, will choose a default max tenoring threshold, or you can set one explicitly at the command line. You could also increase the size of the Eden space by increasing the value that you set for the young generation size minus XMN, or through max new size. What this will do is it causes minor GCs to occur less frequently, which means that the age of the object increments more slowly. Remember, the age of the object is the number of minor GCs that it survived. So if I have less frequent GCs occurring, minor GCs occurring, that age increments slowly, which gives a longer period of time for the object to age in the survivor space. Another one here is reducing the object allocation rate. Again, when you reduce the object allocation rate, your minor GCs occur less frequently, and your object age increments slower. So another strategy here for reducing the promotion rate is to reduce the object retention. So similar to what I talked about in the case of young generation, you have fewer objects to promote into old generation from the minor GC events. This is also going to reduce the required survivor space size that you need to avoid early promotions. What I mean by early promotions is you've got a certain size that you've designated for a survivor space. If there's more objects that are still alive at the end of a minor GC than can fit in the survivor space, they are going to get overflowed into or promoted early or prematurely into old generation. That's what I mean by early promotion. You also reduce object retention. You can also benefit from a reduced frequency of minor GCs, which allows objects to age longer. So pretty much what I had just said. So the other approach here that you could take is, well, I could make old generation size bigger as a way to reduce the old generation collection frequency. So as an example here, this is very similar to what I did here with the illustration of young generation. Suppose I've got an old generation size of 3 gigabyte. I double its size to 6 gigabyte. Same promotion rate, I get a 2x increase in the old generation space. The time between old generation collections increases by 2x. Pretty straightforward, pretty obvious, I think. So the choices for increasing the size of the old generation and the hotspot JVM, for parallel GC, CMS GC, and serial GC, you increase the initial and max Java heap sizes, and then you keep the young generation sizing the same. So in other words, if you're using this XMN or the max and new size or the survivor ratios, you keep them at their same values. So you preserve the sizing of young generation so that you're only increasing the size of old generation. For G1 GC, this may require an increase in both the initial and max Java heap size and also increasing the initiating heap occupancy percent. So this initiating heap occupancy percent is the threshold at which it triggers an old generation collection. So another way that you can reduce old generation collection frequency is to lower the old generation occupancy after the collection. So in other words, I want to have less space occupied in old generation after the collection completes to give me more free space above it for promotions to go into, so it takes longer for that space to fill. So this is a form of lowering object retention. As I mentioned, there's more space available to fill after the old generation collection. This is a similar approach that you would use for reducing object retention that I described earlier. So you end up profiling the application. You look for objects that are unnecessarily kept alive longer than they need to be. So what about the frequency of concurrent collections? So reducing the frequency of a concurrent collection cycle in old generation, your choices are you could increase the occupancy threshold that initiates a concurrent cycle. This is going to reduce the amount of CPU cycles that you're using for GC over the life of the application. But there's a caveat, a trade-off with this, is you may run out of available old generation space and you don't want to lose this race. So what I mean by losing the race is you have this rate at which objects are getting promoted into old generation from the survivor spaces. You have this concurrent collector that's trying to run along and free additional space at the same time. So you don't want to lose the race with the promotion rate. In the hotspot CMS GC, the way that you do this is you tune this initiating heap occupancy fraction. And I'd also suggest that you use this additional command line option, this use CMS initiating occupancy only, which says, I want you to use this heap occupancy fraction always as the threshold at which to start or trigger an old generation collection. In G1 GC, you would use this initiating heap occupancy percent. Okay. Fourth concept, the duration of old generation collections. So here I'm making a distinction between a full GC and an old generation collection. This is oftentimes confusing for people. So a full GC may involve collecting and compacting both the young generation and the old generation. And this happens to be the default behavior for the hotspot JVM. So if somebody says a full GC in the hotspot JVM, it means I'm collecting both young generation and old generation. I'm calling an old generation collection. I'm only collecting old generation. I'm not necessarily compacting the old generation. So in other words, if I don't compact, if all I'm doing is just freeing space, I may have a whole bunch of holes in this Java heap in old generation. I may have some object that gets promoted, but yet the old generation space is fragmented to the point where I can't find a hole large enough to promote an object that I'm trying to promote from young generation. So I'm not including compaction in this description of old generation collection. Okay. So the duration of an old generation collection. So similar to a minor GC, the number of live objects has the strongest influence on the old generation collection duration. There's other things here too that can contribute to old generation collection. Just like we saw with minor GCs, reference objects, weak, soft, phantom, or final. A note here that soft references can also influence the old generation collection frequency, because soft references, the basic idea is you're saying, I've got a bunch of this free space in the Java heap. With the soft reference, it basically is suggesting, I don't want you to free that space until I'm under pressure with available space in the Java heap. So it, in essence, says, I'm going to use that additional space for something like, the temptation for a lot of people is to implement caches, object caches, with soft references. If you want me to get agitated, ask me about soft references as an object cache. That's a hot button with me. Okay, I better get off of that one. The other thing that can impact old generation collection duration is obviously memory locality. It's the same sorts of things that I talked about with young generation collections. So for old generation, what you really would desire and are looking for is you want it to be dominated by the time it takes to mark live objects. And if the GC also does compaction, then you also want the majority of its time to be spent somewhere between, I should say it this way. You want the time to be dominated by the time it takes to mark live objects, and if it does compaction, that should be the second most amount of time spent. So the hotspot parallel GC and serial GC mark live objects and they compact them. They're known as what's called a mark compact collector. These GCs also happen to be called stop the world collectors for both young and old generation collectors. For the mostly concurrent collectors, you desire your time for the old generation collection to be dominated by the time it takes to mark live objects. Notice that the majority of your time spent marking objects is probably going to be done concurrently while the application is running. You may pause the application to do the initial mark. You may pause it again to do a remark to go back and mark the objects that you missed while the application was executing while you were doing the concurrent marking. That's a very common practice with the CMS GC and G1 GC. So one of the caveats with not doing compaction, which is one of the things that CMS GC doesn't do, it's known as a mark sweep collector. You may run into the situation I described earlier where you've got this fragmented Java heap and it results in what's called a promotion failure. And what CMS GC does in this case is it resorts to doing a stop the world full GC. So in the G1 garbage collector, Hotspot achieves this compaction by evacuating live objects from a number of what's called regions. So in G1, it divides the Java heap up into equal-sized regions, and then they're designated as either young generation regions or old generations. So in an old generation collection, it picks a set of old generation regions to evacuate into other available regions, and then they're designated as old generation regions. The evacuation copy time is where you want G1 to spend most of its time outside of the marking. So when it does marking, it's going to mark the entire old generation area. Once that marking is complete, on the next minor GC, it will pick a set of old generation regions to collect at the same time as the minor GC. And it's during that stop the world phase where you want G1 to be spending most of its time in evacuation. In other words, copying that object. Okay, so what can be done to reduce old generation collection pause times? Similar to what we saw for young generation, faster memory, faster CPU, faster system. If it's a stop the world collector you're working with, maybe a faster stop the world collector. Maybe you switch over to using a concurrent collector. And like we saw with the young generation case, you may have some additional CPU consumption here, which could reduce peak throughput. It could also reduce the available capacity of the system. It may also require some additional memory to handle the floating garbage that you have as you're marking. So the other thing that you can do here is you have fewer live objects in old generation. The idea here is that, again, garbage collector is only going to mark live objects and copy or evacuate live objects. So a summary of the concurrent old generation collection trade-offs are, what you're gaining mostly with a concurrent collector is the lower GC pause time, so you get this improved latency. So here I'm tying this back to the performance attributes. What you're sacrificing and giving up is, you're usually going to give up some Java heap. So you're going to use a little bit more memory. You're going to have a little bit more footprint here. You're probably going to use a little more CPU. So you may be inhibiting some on the capacity. So the translation here is, for the improved latency, you're sacrificing something in at least one of these, or possibly all three of the footprint, the throughput, and the capacity. And as I said earlier, that may be fine for some applications. It may make people pretty sensitive in others. It depends on the application and the stakeholders as to what's most important to them. So for strategies in this last one of the fewer live objects, well, we could create a larger old generation space. Maybe that would help. Well, possibly. In general, if we increase the size, it allows more objects to die. An example here where this would work is, if the length of a typical application transaction is greater than the time between the old generation collections, then increasing the size of the old generation could reduce the number of live objects that are marked during an old generation collection. So I think that that's pretty straightforward. So that would be a case where it could help you. Okay. So moving on to a summary here. So the thing I'd like you to take away from this session is, I'd like you to think about GC in terms of the garbage collection frequency and duration that you're trying to meet. For both the young generation and the old generation collections. And also, if you think about the impact of footprint, latency, throughput, and capacity, you can start to reason about the different choices that you have. And as you make a given action, what the consequences of taking that action is going to be. And in the end, hopefully it gets you to the point where you're able to realize your capacity goals, throughput goals, footprint goals, and throughput goals for your application. Some credits to give here. A huge thank you to all of the Hotspot GC team members, past and present. Countless others past and present from the Hotspot JVM team. I've been working with the Hotspot JVM team for, well, I'm approaching 15 years now. And an enormous amount of things that I've learned from the members on that team. Last slide, and I promise here, some additional reading material here. Obviously, the Java Performance book. My publisher will be very happy that I mentioned this today. You can buy this book tomorrow on informant.com for under $20. There's a new book out by Scott Oakes called Java Performance, the Definitive Guide. I've known Scott for about 15 years, had the pleasure of working daily with Scott for probably 5 years. I continue to work with Scott today. Scott is one of those guys that his information, when he puts it out in print, I find that it's very easy to understand. It's very easy to digest and interpret what he's saying. The way that I would look at Scott's book compared to mine is I think that they're very complementary to each other. If you want to get into a lot of the gory details about the JVM and garbage collectors and JVM tuning, you'll find that in my book. If you want a little bit higher level perspective, you can look at Scott's book. There's certainly pieces in Scott's that are not in mine. That's why I would say that they're complementary. If you want to know anything and everything about garbage collection of other languages, the book to have is the Garbage Collection Handbook by Jones. Anybody who is a GC engineer or a GC junkie has a copy of this book. It's probably one of my more favorite books. Okay, I'll leave that slide here. We've got about 5 minutes unless people are anxious to get out and grab a bite to eat.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. All right, questions. Who wants to go? Oh, uh-oh. Here we go. We have, is it an easy one?
So what do you think about caching objects in soft references?
You got the
All right,
hot
I'll
button.
hold him down. And,
We've had this discussion, so for the people in the audience that are not familiar with Gil, this is Gil Tanay from Azul Systems, and we participate in several different online forums and such where the discussion came up one time about soft references and using them as caches and object caches. The biggest problem that I see with soft references as a cache is it's unfortunate that the Java doc suggests this idea. From a performance standpoint, there's a couple of issues here. One of them I touched on briefly, and that is if you're using a soft reference, you're basically saying, okay, I want to use more Java heap space. But that basically is starting to say, okay, I've now got more work for the garbage collector to do, which increases the duration of GC. I'm also going to get a GC more frequently. So that kind of goes against the frequency of GCs and something that I'm trying to, I may be trying to avoid. But what I think is what in my opinion, I think is probably the biggest challenge with soft references is there's not a specification that says, here's exactly how soft references should be processed. Even within the same JVM, if you have a soft reference object cache, you use parallel GC and you move to CMS GC, you're going to get different behavior. If you move to G1 GC, you'll get different behavior of that object cache. If you move to a different JVM, say it's JRocket or Azul Zing, you're going to get different characteristics. If you move to J9, it's going to behave differently. So my reaction to that is, why would I build an object cache where I'm at the mercy of the JVM's GC implementation that dictates the behavior of my object cache? Other questions?
any other takers? Going once? Going, oh, this is your chance, folks. All right.
I think everybody's hungry.
I think we're all standing between people and food, so maybe we should stop doing that.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.